Congratulations, Burkina Faso. And America. Your dollar's monopoly ends today. I stand before 53 African leaders with 47 tons of physical gold. Today, we launch our own gold-backed African currency, African Gold Standard. 1 AGS equals zero point 0.1 grams of gold, controlled by us, no dollars needed. And I just destroyed the dollar's monopoly over African trade. We're not using your currency anymore. We're not accepting your manipulation anymore. We built our own system. No Washington approval required, no American permission asked. Your currency is now optional in Africa. Let me tell you what just happened, what you're watching in real time, what the Federal Reserve is panicking about right now. For years, you controlled us through the dollar. Every trade required dollars. Every transaction went through your banks. Every payment gave you leverage. You weaponized currency. You manipulated exchange rates. You extracted wealth through a system we were forced to use. That system died this morning. The African Gold Bank is operational. 47 tons of gold in our vault. 5 nations contributing: Mali, Niger, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, Burkina Faso. Each nation deposited gold. Each government now has access to financing without dollars. Each country can trade without touching your currency. We're processing transactions right now. Mali buying oil from Nigeria, payment in AGS, no dollars involved. Niger exporting uranium to South Africa, settlement in gold-backed currency. No Federal Reserve approval needed. Zimbabwe trading minerals with Kenya, bypassing dollar infrastructure completely. Your monopoly is broken. Your control is ending. Your currency dominance is collapsing. Listen to me, Jerome Powell. Listen to me, U.S. Treasury. Listen to me, every Western banker who thought dollar hegemony was permanent. You built your power on forcing everyone to use your currency. You maintained control by making dollars mandatory for international trade. You extracted wealth by manipulating a system we had no choice but to accept. We have a choice now, and we're choosing gold over dollars, sovereignty over submission, freedom over your financial control. The African Gold Standard isn't just currency, it's a declaration. Africa will no longer finance American deficit spending by holding dollar reserves. We will no longer accept inflation exported through your monetary policy. We will no longer tolerate manipulation of exchange rates that benefit you while impoverishing us. We're converting our dollar reserves to gold. We're settling trade in AGS. We're building payment systems that bypass SWIFT entirely. We're creating a financial ecosystem where your currency is irrelevant. And other nations are watching. Saudi Arabia is calling. China is interested. Russia is exploring. India is asking questions. Brazil wants details. The entire global south is realizing that dollar dependence is optional, that alternatives exist, that your monetary hegemony was always built on forcing compliance, not genuine superiority. You threatened sanctions. We built alternative payment systems. You threatened to freeze dollar reserves. We converted them to gold you can't touch. You threatened financial isolation. We created continental networks that don't need your participation. Every weapon you deployed backfired. Every threat strengthened our resolve. Every pressure campaign convinced more nations to join us. Listen to me, African leaders. Listen to every finance minister, every central bank governor, every president watching this. You have a choice. Continue holding dollars that America prints without limit, that lose value through inflation you can't control, that can be frozen whenever Washington disagrees with your policies. Or join the African Gold Standard. Convert your reserves to gold. Trade in currency backed by physical assets. Build independence from dollar manipulation. 10 nations are already negotiating membership. 20 more are exploring options. 30 are requesting technical briefings. The movement is accelerating, not slowing, building momentum. Spreading across the continent. Dollar dominance in Africa will be history. The global south will have parallel financial infrastructure completely independent of Western control. Historians will look back at this moment as the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony. This isn't speculation, this is the trajectory we're on, the path we're walking, the future we're building, and there's nothing the Federal Reserve can do to stop it. Let me paint you the precise picture of what the next look like. Not vague predictions, not hopeful projections. Concrete milestones that are already being planned, already being built, already becoming inevitable. 20 African nations join the Gold Bank, not just the original 5, but Nigeria with its massive economy and oil wealth, Kenya with its entrepreneurial population and mobile money innovation, South Africa with its sophisticated financial markets and gold reserves, Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and 7 others. Each nation contributing gold reserves, each government accessing financing without dollars, each country trading in AGS instead of your currency. The combined GDP of Gold Bank members reaches $2 trillion. That's $2 trillion of economic activity that no longer requires dollar transactions. $2 trillion of trade that bypasses your currency. $2 trillion of wealth that escapes your control. Your Treasury Department calculates the impact. Your Federal Reserve models the consequences. Your economists write papers about the threat, but they can't stop 20 sovereign nations from choosing to use their own currency instead of yours. 40% of intra-African trade settles in AGS. Not dollars, not euros. Our own gold-backed currency. The percentage grows every month. Every week brings new trade agreements denominated in AGS. Every day sees more transactions processed outside dollar systems. The shift is measurable. The trend is undeniable. The trajectory is irreversible. Your currency's role in African trade is collapsing in real time. The payment infrastructure is complete. We're not just trading in AGS. We've built the entire financial architecture to support it. Swift alternatives that process transactions instantly. Clearing systems that settle trades without touching New York. Banking networks that connect African financial institutions directly. Mobile payment platforms that allow ordinary Africans to use AGS for daily transactions. A farmer in Nigeria sells crops to a buyer in Kenya. Payment in AGS. Instant settlement. No dollar conversion. No Western bank intermediary. No transaction fees paid to your financial system. A manufacturer in South Africa exports to Tanzania. Payment in AGS. Direct transfer. No currency risk. No exchange rate manipulation. The trade happens entirely within African financial infrastructure. We launch AGS-denominated bonds. African governments issuing debt in our own currency. Investors buying bonds backed by gold instead of dollars. Pension funds diversifying into AGS assets. Central banks holding AGS reserves. Your treasury bonds lose buyers. Your debt becomes harder to sell. Your ability to finance deficits through foreign purchases of your bonds diminishes. The demand for dollars drops as alternatives emerge. 35 African nations are now Gold Bank members. The holdouts are joining, not because we forced them, because the benefits are undeniable. Because access to financing without IMF conditions is attractive. Because trading without dollar dependency is liberating. Because sovereignty over monetary policy is valuable. The network effects are powerful. The more nations that join, the more valuable membership becomes. The larger the AGS economy grows, the more essential participation is. The African Gold Bank is now financing major infrastructure across the continent. The Trans-Sahara Railway connecting North and West Africa, built with AGS financing, paid for with gold-backed currency. No dollar loans required. The East African power grid linking 6 nations, financed through Gold Bank bonds, constructed by African contractors, operated by African utilities. The Southern African water pipeline, the West African fiber optic network, the Central African highway system, all financed with AGS, all built without dollars, all proving that African development doesn't require American currency. Major commodity trades are settling in AGS. Nigerian oil sold to South Africa. Payment in gold-backed currency. Zambian copper exported to Egypt. Settlement in AGS. Ghanaian cocoa shipped to Kenya. Transaction in our currency. The commodities that once required dollar pricing are now being traded in African currency. The petrodollar system that gave your currency global dominance is being circumvented in African markets. The contagion spreads beyond Africa. Southeast Asian nations are watching our success. Indonesia approaches the Gold Bank about partnership. Malaysia requests technical briefings. Thailand explores joining. They see what we've built. They understand the model. They recognize that dollar dependence is optional. They calculate that alternatives are viable. The ASEAN nations announce plans for a regional gold-backed currency modeled on AGS, not replacing their national currencies, but creating a regional trade currency backed by gold reserves. The Asian Gold Standard, linked to AGS through convertibility agreements, allowing trade between Africa and Asia without dollars. Your currency is being systematically excluded from the fastest-growing trade relationships in the world. Latin America follows. Brazil leads the discussion. Argentina joins immediately. Chile contributes gold reserves. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, and 4 others commit to a Latin American gold standard. Another regional currency backed by physical gold. Another trading system that bypasses dollars. Another block of nations opting out of your monetary hegemony. The global south is coordinating, learning from each other, building parallel infrastructure, creating alternatives that don't require your permission or participation. Gold-backed regional currencies cover 4 billion people. Africa's AGS, Asia's gold standard, Latin America's system, all linked through convertibility, all backed by physical gold, all operating outside dollar infrastructure. More than half of humanity now has access to currency systems that don't depend on your Federal Reserve. The dollar's role as global reserve currency is being systematically dismantled through the creation of viable alternatives. The tipping point arrives. Saudi Arabia announces it will accept AGS for oil sales, not exclusively, but as an option alongside dollars. The petrodollar system that has sustained dollar dominance since 1974 begins cracking. If oil can be purchased with gold-backed African currency, the fundamental reason for holding dollars diminishes. The demand for your currency drops dramatically, the value declines, the dominance erodes. Russia follows immediately. Oil and gas sales to Africa and Asia can be settled in AGS or regional gold standards. No dollars required. China makes a similar announcement for trade with global South nations. Yuan or gold-backed currencies accepted, dollars optional. The 3 largest commodity exporters outside the West are now accepting alternatives to your currency. The dollar's monopoly on international trade is breaking. Dollar dominance in Africa is history. Over 70% of intra-African trade settles in AGS. Over 60% of Africa's trade with Asia uses gold-backed currencies. Over 50% of commodity exports are priced in alternatives to dollars. Your currency still exists in African markets, but it's no longer dominant, it's no longer essential. It's no longer the only option. It's become one currency among several, and its share continues declining. The global South will have parallel financial infrastructure completely independent of Western control. Let me describe what that infrastructure looks like, what it means, how it functions, why it's permanent. The parallel banking system is complete, not branches of Western banks operating in developing countries, but indigenous banks owned by global South nations, capitalized with gold reserves, operating under rules they control. The African Development Bank is restructured around gold backing. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank expands to include gold-based financing. The Latin American Development Bank launches with gold reserves. These aren't Western-controlled institutions imposing conditions. These are regional banks serving regional interests with regional capital. The clearing systems are operational. Every region has its own system for settling international transactions. Africa has the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System processing AGS transactions. Asia has the Asian Clearing Union expanded to handle gold-backed currencies. Latin America has Mercosur's clearing system upgraded for regional gold standards. These systems connect to each other through bilateral agreements. They process transactions without routing through New York. They settle trades without touching dollar infrastructure. They operate completely independently of SWIFT and Western financial networks. The credit rating agencies are replaced. The Western agencies that used ratings as weapons to punish non-compliant nations are being bypassed. The Global South Credit Rating Agency is established, funded by member nations, staffed by their economists, using methodologies that assess real economic factors instead of political compliance. When this agency rates sovereign debt, it evaluates actual ability to repay rather than willingness to follow Western policy. The ratings are more accurate, more fair, more trusted by investors who understand the bias in Western ratings. The development finance institutions are transformed. The World Bank and IMF are increasingly irrelevant, not because they were abolished, because they were made obsolete. The Gold Bank and its regional equivalents provide development financing without policy conditions. They offer loans at rates the IMF can't match. They provide capital without sovereignty-destroying terms. Nations that once had no choice but to accept IMF programs now have alternatives, better alternatives. Alternatives that don't require surrendering economic policy to foreign institutions. The currency swap agreements are comprehensive. Every major global South nation has bilateral agreements allowing trade in national currencies or gold-backed regional currencies. China and Brazil trade in yuan or reals. India and South Africa trade in rupees or AGS. Indonesia and Nigeria trade in rupiah or AGS. The network of swap agreements is so extensive that dollars are rarely needed for South-South trade. The currency that once was essential for international commerce is now optional for the majority of global trade. The gold reserves are consolidated. The global South nations that once stored gold in London and New York vaults are repatriating their reserves, bringing gold home, building their own storage facilities, securing their own wealth. By 2034, over 60% of global gold reserves are held in global South vaults. The physical gold that backs these new currencies is in their possession, under their control. Not hypothetical claims on gold stored in Western vaults, actual physical metal they can touch and verify. The commodity pricing moves away from dollars. Oil is quoted in multiple currencies. Gold itself is priced in AGS as well as dollars. Copper, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements are traded in yuan or regional gold standards. The automatic dollar pricing of commodities that sustained your currency's dominance is ending. Sellers and buyers are choosing to transact in currencies that better serve their interests. Your currency's role in commodity markets shrinks from monopoly to one option among many. The reserve currency diversification accelerates. Central banks that once held 70% of reserves in dollars are rebalancing. The average is 40% dollars, 30% gold, and 30% in regional gold-backed currencies. Your currency is still the largest single reserve asset, but it's no longer dominant, it's no longer the overwhelming choice, it's no longer the automatic default. Central banks are hedging against dollar risk by diversifying into alternatives that didn't exist a decade earlier. The financial sanctions lose effectiveness. When you freeze dollar assets, nations shrug and use alternatives. When you block SWIFT access, they process transactions through parallel systems. When you impose secondary sanctions threatening anyone who trades with targeted nations, global South countries ignore the threats because they're not dependent on dollar systems. Your primary tool for economic coercion becomes impotent against nations that opted out of your financial infrastructure. The debt dynamics reverse. Global South nations that once borrowed in dollars are refinancing in their own currencies. The currency mismatch that made them vulnerable to dollar appreciation is eliminated. The debt service that drained their reserves is reduced. The dependency that gave you leverage is ended. They're issuing bonds in AGS or regional currencies. They're borrowing from gold bank institutions. They're financing development without the dollar debt that once controlled them. Historians will look back at this moment as the beginning of the end of dollar hegemony. Let me explain what historians will write, how they'll analyze this period, what they'll identify as the key turning points, why they'll see this as inevitable in retrospect. They'll identify as the year dollar hegemony peaked, the moment of maximum dominance before the decline began. They'll note that after Bretton Woods, the dollar reached its highest share of global reserves, its greatest role in international trade, its peak use in commodity pricing, and they'll mark this as the high point before the fall, the moment when the system was most powerful and most vulnerable, most dominant and most fragile. They'll analyze the African Gold Bank launch as the catalyst, not the only factor, but the spark that ignited broader change. They'll study how a small group of African nations created an alternative that inspired others, how the demonstration effect spread from Africa to Asia to Latin America, how the proof of concept in Burkina Faso became a model replicated globally, how one regional currency experiment became a template for dismantling dollar dominance. They'll examine the structural factors that made dollar hegemony unsustainable, the U.S. trade deficits that required constant dollar creation, the debt accumulation that undermined confidence, the weaponization of finance that motivated nations to seek alternatives, the sanctions overused that accelerated de-dollarization, the monetary policy that exported inflation globally. They'll see that dollar dominance contained the seeds of its own destruction, that the very tools used to maintain hegemony ultimately undermined it. They'll document the technological enablers that made alternatives viable, the digital payment systems that allowed instant settlement without correspondent banking, the blockchain technologies that enabled transparent gold backing verification, the mobile platforms that brought gold-backed currencies to ordinary people, the cryptographic tools that secured transactions outside Western systems. They'll recognize that technology made possible what was previously impractical. That innovation enabled the infrastructure for post-dollar systems. They'll trace the geopolitical realignment that accompanied monetary change, how dollar decline correlated with American power decline, how currency diversification reflected multipolar world emergence, how monetary sovereignty became expression of political sovereignty, how financial independence enabled foreign policy independence. They'll see monetary history as inseparable from political history, that currency dominance and geopolitical dominance rose and fell together. They'll study the resistance and how it failed. The Federal Reserve's attempts to maintain dollar dominance through interest rate policy. The Treasury's efforts to prevent alternatives through sanctions threats. The State Department's diplomatic pressure on nations considering de-dollarization. The Pentagon's strategic calculations about protecting dollar hegemony. They'll document all the efforts to preserve the system, and they'll analyze why all those efforts ultimately failed. Why determination of nations seeking sovereignty overcame power of nations seeking to maintain dominance. They'll examine the winners and losers, the global South nations that gained monetary sovereignty and economic independence, the commodity exporters that captured more value by pricing in their own currencies, the regional powers that built influence through gold-backed financial systems, and the losers, the United States that lost the exorbitant privilege of printing the global reserve currency, the Western financial institutions that lost their monopoly on international finance, the dollar holders whose savings were devalued by the currency's decline. They'll debate the counterfactuals. What if the IMF had reformed to offer financing without conditions? What if the US had not weaponized the dollar through sanctions? What if Western institutions had treated global South nations as equals rather than subordinates? What if the international monetary system had been restructured to be more equitable? They'll argue about whether dollar hegemony's end was inevitable or whether different policies could have sustained it, whether this was structural decline or strategic failure. They'll compare this to previous monetary transitions, the end of the gold standard, the collapse of Bretton Woods, the Asian financial crisis. They'll analyze what made this transition different, faster, more coordinated, more driven by deliberate policy choices rather than crisis. They'll note that unlike previous transitions that happened reactively, this one was proactive. Nations chose to build alternatives before the dollar system collapsed. They prepared for the transition rather than being forced into it by crisis. They'll assess the long-term consequences, how the end of dollar hegemony affected global trade patterns, how monetary sovereignty influenced development trajectories, how financial independence shaped political alignments, how the multipolar monetary system compared to the unipolar dollar system in terms of stability, equity, and efficiency. They'll evaluate whether the post-dollar world was better or worse, more stable or more chaotic, more fair or more fragmented. They'll identify this moment, this speech, this announcement as historically significant, not because one leader's words changed everything, but because those words articulated what many were thinking, crystallized what many were planning, announced what many were building. They'll see this as the moment when the unspoken became spoken, when the hidden became visible, when the inevitable became acknowledged. And they'll conclude that dollar hegemony was always temporary, that no single currency could dominate forever, that the very success that gave the dollar global role contained the factors that would end that role. That hegemony breeds resistance, that dominance motivates alternatives, that monopoly creates incentives for competition. They'll see this not as accident or conspiracy, but as historical pattern. As inevitable as the rise was the fall. You can raise interest rates. We don't borrow in dollars anymore. Go ahead, raise them to 5%, to 7%, to 10% if you want. Make borrowing dollars expensive. Make holding dollar debt painful. Make servicing dollar loans crushing. See if we care. See if it changes anything. See if it stops what we're building. We don't borrow in dollars anymore. That's not rhetoric. That's fact. Burkina Faso's government debt is denominated in AGS. Our bonds are issued in gold-backed currency. Our loans come from the gold bank. Our financing is in our own currency, backed by our own gold. When you raise interest rates, you're making dollars more expensive to borrow. But we're not borrowing dollars, so your interest rate policy is irrelevant to us. Mali doesn't borrow in dollars. Niger doesn't borrow in dollars. Zimbabwe doesn't borrow in dollars. Eritrea doesn't borrow in dollars. The 20 nations in the gold bank don't borrow in dollars. We've exited your debt system entirely. We've stopped taking loans in your currency. We've ended our dependence on dollar financing. Your interest rates affect dollar borrowers. We're not dollar borrowers anymore. Your policy tool doesn't reach us. The 35 nations joining by won't borrow in dollars. They're learning from our example. They're seeing that dollar debt is a trap. They're recognizing that borrowing in foreign currency creates vulnerability. They're understanding that monetary sovereignty requires borrowing in your own currency. They're choosing to finance development through gold bank loans in AGS rather than IMF loans in dollars. Your interest rates will be irrelevant to them too. You can raise rates to attract capital, but you're competing against gold-backed currencies that can't be printed into inflation. You're competing against bonds backed by physical assets. You're competing against currencies that maintain value because they're tied to gold rather than government promises. Investors are diversifying. They're reducing dollar exposure. They're buying AGS bonds and regional gold standard securities. Your higher rates attract some capital, but not enough to offset the structural shift away from dollar dependence. You can raise rates to defend the dollar's value, but you're fighting against fundamentals, against declining demand for dollars in international trade, against reduced need for dollar reserves, against countries actively diversifying away from your currency, against the reality that fewer people need dollars for fewer transactions. You can make dollars more expensive to borrow, but you can't make people need dollars they don't need. You can't force demand that doesn't exist. You can't compel use of a currency people are choosing to avoid. Your interest rate weapon worked when everyone borrowed in dollars, when all international debt was denominated in your currency, when raising rates made debt service painful and forced policy changes. But we've exited that system. We've stopped borrowing in dollars. We've eliminated the vulnerability your interest rate policy exploited. You're wielding a weapon that no longer hits its target. You're using a tool that no longer works on nations that opted out. You can manipulate exchange rates. We don't use your currency for trade. Manipulate away. Strengthen the dollar to make imports cheaper. Weaken it to boost exports. Use your central bank to intervene in currency markets. Deploy your Treasury's Exchange Stabilization Fund. Coordinate with other central banks for maximum impact. See if it matters to us. See if it changes our trajectory. See if it stops what we're building. We don't use your currency for trade. Not with each other. Not increasingly with partners outside Africa. When Nigeria sells oil to South Africa, the transaction is in AGS. When Kenya exports to Tanzania, payment is in AGS. When Ghana trades with Mali, settlement is in AGS. Your exchange rate manipulations affect dollar-denominated trade. We're not doing dollar-denominated trade anymore. Your currency interventions don't impact transactions that don't involve your currency. The exchange rate between dollars and AGS is increasingly irrelevant. It exists. Markets still price it, but it matters less every month, because fewer transactions require converting between the currencies, because trade is settling in AGS directly, because the need to exchange dollars for AGS is diminishing. You can manipulate the exchange rate, but if people aren't exchanging the currencies, the manipulation is meaningless. You can try to weaken AGS relative to dollars. Good luck. Our currency is backed by gold. Physical gold in vaults we control. You can't print more gold. You can't create gold through monetary policy. You can't inflate gold supply through quantitative easing. The backing is real. The value is tangible. Your ability to manipulate a gold-backed currency is limited by physical reality. You can affect market sentiment temporarily, but you can't change the fundamental backing. You can try to create volatility in AGS to undermine confidence. You can use your financial resources to buy and sell large amounts. You can attempt to destabilize our currency through market manipulation. But we've prepared for this. We have gold reserves to defend the peg. We have capital controls to prevent speculation. We have cooperation agreements with other gold bank members to coordinate defense. Your manipulation attempts will be expensive. They'll be visible. And they'll fail because we're committed to defending our currency with all necessary resources. Your exchange rate manipulation worked when everyone needed to convert to dollars for international trade, when all commodity prices were in dollars, when all major transactions required dollar exchange. But we've built systems that bypass dollar conversion. We've created direct trading relationships in AGS. We've eliminated the need for dollar intermediation. You can manipulate exchange rates, but you can't force people to make exchanges they don't need to make. You can freeze reserves. We converted them to gold in our own vaults. Freeze them. Freeze every dollar reserve African central banks hold in New York. Freeze every treasury bond we own. Freeze every dollar-denominated asset you can reach. See what happens. See if it stops us. See if it changes anything. We converted our reserves to gold. Not gold certificates in your vaults, physical gold in our vaults, in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Harare, in Asmara, gold we can see, gold we can touch, gold we control. You can't freeze gold in our possession, you can't seize assets in our territory, you can't reach gold that's in our vaults protected by our security forces. Your freeze power extends to assets in your jurisdiction. We moved our assets out of your jurisdiction. The 47 tons of gold backing AGS is in Africa, not in London, not in New York, not in Western vaults where you could freeze or seize it, in African vaults built specifically to be beyond your reach. You can freeze dollar reserves, but you can't freeze gold reserves that aren't in your custody. Your power to freeze assets depends on those assets being in your system. We took our assets out of your system. The other Gold Bank members learned from our example. They're repatriating gold, bringing reserves home, building secure storage, taking physical possession. Nigeria is moving gold from London. South Africa is retrieving gold from New York. Kenya is repatriating reserves from Switzerland. They're all doing what we did, taking their wealth out of your reach, eliminating your ability to freeze their reserves, protecting their assets from your sanctions. You can freeze the dollar reserves we haven't converted yet. Some African nations still hold significant dollar reserves. You can freeze those. You can seize those. You can use them as leverage. But every time you do, you prove our point. You demonstrate why dollar reserves are dangerous. You show why gold in your own vaults is safer than dollars in their vaults. You convince more nations to convert, to repatriate, to protect their wealth from your sanctions. Your freeze power is self-limiting. Every use of it motivates more countries to move assets beyond your reach. You can freeze reserves as punishment, but punishment only works if the target cares. If freezing dollar reserves would cripple our economy, it would be effective leverage. But we've built systems that function without dollar reserves. We've created liquidity through gold backing. We've established trade that doesn't require dollar reserves for settlement. You can freeze reserves we're not using, but freezing unused reserves doesn't hurt us. It just confirms we were right to stop depending on them. Your freeze power was your ultimate financial weapon, the ability to seize assets held in your system, the capacity to punish nations by freezing their reserves, the leverage that came from everyone needing to hold dollars in your banks. But we've neutralized that weapon. We've moved our assets beyond your reach. We've converted reserves you could freeze into gold you can't touch. We've eliminated the vulnerability your freeze power exploited. You can threaten sanctions. We built systems that bypass your financial infrastructure. Threaten away. Threaten to sanction every African nation in the gold bank. Threaten to cut us off from dollar systems. Threaten to block transactions through your banks. Threaten secondary sanctions on anyone who trades with us. Make all the threats you want. See if we comply. See if we back down. See if we abandon what we've built. We built systems that bypass your financial infrastructure. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System processes transactions without touching your banks. The AGS clearing system settles trades without routing through New York. The Gold Bank provides financing without your institutions. We've created parallel infrastructure that functions independently of your system. Your sanctions threaten to cut us off from infrastructure we're not using anymore. You can sanction our access to SWIFT. We built our own messaging system for international transactions. You can block our banks from correspondent relationships with Western banks. We established direct relationships between African banks. You can prohibit your companies from trading with us. We're trading with each other and with non-Western partners. Every sanction threat assumes we're dependent on access to your systems. We're not dependent anymore. We built alternatives. You can impose secondary sanctions threatening to punish anyone who trades with us. That worked when everyone needed access to your market and your currency, but China doesn't fear your secondary sanctions. Russia ignores them. India works around them. The nations we're trading with are either already sanctioned or too large to sanction effectively. Your secondary sanctions threat is powerful against small nations dependent on Western markets. It's impotent against large nations and coordinated blocs. You can sanction individuals, freeze assets of Gold Bank officials, ban travel of African leaders supporting AGS, target specific people involved in building alternatives to your system. But sanctioning individuals doesn't stop institutions. Freezing one official's assets doesn't shut down the Gold Bank. Banning one leader's travel doesn't end AGS. You can make life difficult for individuals, but you can't sanction an entire system into non-existence. You can sanction specific transactions, block particular trades, freeze specific payments, target individual deals, but we're processing thousands of transactions daily through our systems. You can't sanction them all. You can't monitor every trade. You can't block every payment. The volume overwhelms your enforcement capacity. The alternatives we built give us too many routes around your sanctions. You can stop some transactions, but you can't stop the system. Your sanctions worked when there were no alternatives, when being cut off from Western systems meant being cut off from international commerce, when losing dollar access meant losing ability to trade. But we built alternatives. We created systems that work without you. We established infrastructure that bypasses you. Your sanctions threaten to exclude us from systems we've already exited. The threat is empty because we're not dependent on what you're threatening to take away. Your weapons are useless against nations that opted out of your system entirely. That's the fundamental reality you're struggling to accept. That's the truth you're refusing to acknowledge. That's the fact that makes all your threats meaningless. We opted out. We left your system. We built alternatives. And your weapons only work against nations inside your system. Interest rates only matter to dollar borrowers. We're not dollar borrowers. Exchange rate manipulation only affects dollar trade. We're not using dollars for trade. Reserve freezes only hurt nations with reserves in your custody. Our reserves are in our vaults. Sanctions only work against nations dependent on your infrastructure. We built our own infrastructure. Every weapon in your arsenal assumes dependence on your system, assumes need for your currency, assumes requirement for your infrastructure, assumes vulnerability to your control. But we've eliminated the dependence. We've ended the need. We've removed the requirement. We've closed the vulnerability. Your weapons are designed for a world where everyone has to use your system. We've created a world where your system is optional, and we're choosing not to use it. Let me explain exactly how we eliminated every single dependency you relied on, how we closed every vulnerability you exploited, how we removed every requirement that gave you power. Because understanding this is understanding why your threats are empty, why your weapons miss their target, why your leverage is gone. We eliminated dollar dependence for trade. For 70 years, African nations needed dollars to trade with each other. Nigerian oil sold to South Africa required dollar payment. Kenyan goods exported to Ghana needed dollar settlement. Every transaction between African nations somehow involved your currency. You weren't party to the trade, but your currency was mandatory. That gave you power. Power to monitor every transaction. Power to block trades you opposed. Power to extract fees from commerce you didn't participate in. That dependence is gone, ended, eliminated. Nigerian oil now sells to South Africa in AGS. Kenyan exports to Ghana settle in gold-backed currency. African trade happens in African currency. Your dollar is not involved, not needed, not wanted. The dependence you exploited for decades no longer exists. We eliminated dollar dependence for reserves. Central banks held dollars because international trade required dollars. If you needed dollars for transactions, you needed dollar reserves for liquidity. The logic was inescapable. The dependency was structural. You didn't have to force African central banks to hold dollars. The system forced them, but that system is broken now, shattered, destroyed. Central banks hold gold instead of dollars, physical gold that backs AGS, tangible assets that maintain value, real wealth that can't be printed or manipulated. The reserves that once sat in your banks generating your power now sit in our vaults generating our independence. The structural dependency is eliminated. We eliminated dollar dependence for debt. Governments borrowed in dollars because lenders demanded it. International bonds were denominated in dollars. Development loans came in dollars. The debt that financed African development created dollar dependence that gave you control. Debt service required earning dollars. Earning dollars required policies you approved. The debt trap was elegant, sophisticated, nearly invisible, but we saw it, understood it, escaped it. Government debt is now denominated in AGS. Bonds are issued in gold-backed currency. Development loans come from the gold bank in our own currency. Debt service doesn't require earning dollars, doesn't require policies you approve, doesn't give you leverage over our governments. The debt dependency is broken. We eliminated dollar dependence for commodities. Oil priced in dollars, gold quoted in dollars, copper, cobalt, lithium all valued in your currency. Commodity pricing in dollars wasn't natural, wasn't inevitable. It was imposed, maintained, enforced. It created artificial demand for your currency. If you needed to buy commodities, you needed dollars first. That gave you power over commodity markets, power over producing nations, power over consuming nations. That power is ending, evaporating, disappearing. Commodities are now priced in AGS. Oil sells in gold-backed currency. Minerals trade in our system. The automatic dollar pricing is being replaced by pricing in currencies that better serve producers and consumers. The commodity dependency is finished. We eliminated dollar dependence for investment. Foreign investment came in dollars. Returns were paid in dollars. The investment flows that developed African economies created dollar dependence that gave you leverage. If investment came in dollars, you could threaten to cut it off. If returns were paid in dollars, you could threaten to block them. The leverage was real. The threat was credible. The dependency gave you power. But investment now comes in AGS. Foreign investors buy gold-backed bonds. Returns are paid in gold-backed currency. The investment flows that develop our economies don't create dollar dependence anymore. Don't give you leverage, don't provide you power. The investment dependency is ended. We've ended the need for your currency in every function it served. Trade doesn't need dollars. Reserves don't need dollars. Debt doesn't need dollars. Commodities don't need dollars. Investment doesn't need dollars. The need you created through system design has been eliminated through system redesign. We built alternatives for every function your currency performed. We created substitutes for every role dollars played. We established infrastructure that makes your currency optional. The need is gone, completely, permanently, irreversibly. We've removed the requirement for your infrastructure in every transaction we conduct. SWIFT is not required for international payments. We built Pan-African payment and settlement system. Correspondent banking is not required for cross-border transfers. We established direct bank relationships. New York clearing is not required for trade settlement. We created our own clearing systems. Western financial institutions are not required for any function we perform. Not payments, not clearing, not settlement, not custody, not anything. The requirements you impose through infrastructure monopoly have been removed through infrastructure competition. We built alternatives. We use alternatives. We don't need your infrastructure anymore. We've closed the vulnerability to your control in every aspect of our financial system. You can't freeze assets in our vaults. You can't block transactions in our systems. You can't monitor trades in our networks. You can't manipulate currencies backed by physical gold. You can't impose conditions on loans from our banks. You can't threaten sanctions that hurt economies operating outside your infrastructure. Every vulnerability you exploited has been identified and closed. Every weakness you attacked has been reinforced and protected. Every dependency you leveraged has been eliminated and replaced. The vulnerabilities are closed. The weaknesses are gone. The dependencies are ended. Your weapons are designed for a world where everyone has to use your system, where dollars are mandatory for trade, where your banks are required for transactions, where your infrastructure is essential for commerce, where your currency is unavoidable for reserves. That world existed for 70 years. That world gave you enormous power. That world is ending. We've created a world where your system is optional, where alternatives exist, where choices are available, where your currency is one option among several, where your infrastructure is unnecessary for most of what we do. Your weapons were designed for the old world. They don't work in the new world we're building. We've created a world where your system is optional, and we're choosing not to use it. That choice is the death of your power. That choice is the end of your dominance. That choice is the collapse of your hegemony. Because power built on forcing people to use your system disappears when people can choose not to use it. Control based on being the only option evaporates when alternatives emerge. Leverage derived from dependency vanishes when dependency is eliminated. Your power was always based on lack of alternatives. We created alternatives. Your control was always based on forced participation. We made participation optional. Your leverage was always based on our dependency. We eliminated the dependency. We're choosing not to use your system, not because we're irrational, not because we're reckless, not because we don't understand economics. We're choosing not to use your system because using it costs more than the benefits it provides, because the price of participation is loss of sovereignty, because the cost of access is surrender of control, because the fee for inclusion is subordination to your interests. We calculated the costs and benefits. We compared your system to alternatives. We chose the alternative that serves us better. That's not irrationality. That's rational choice. That's not recklessness. That's careful calculation. That's not ignorance. That's understanding. The choice to opt out is spreading. Mali chose not to use your system. Niger chose not to use your system. Zimbabwe chose not to use your system. Eritrea chose not to use your system. 20 nations by 2025 will choose not to use your system. 35 nations by 2027 will choose not to use your system. The choice is contagious. The example is powerful. The demonstration is convincing. Every nation that chooses to opt out makes opting out easier for the next nation. Every alternative that succeeds makes alternatives more attractive. Every system that works outside your control makes your control less necessary. You're trying to fight us with tools that don't work on us. You're deploying weapons that miss their target. You're using leverage you don't have. You're threatening consequences we don't fear. Your tools were designed for nations trapped in your system. Interest rate policy works on dollar borrowers. We're not dollar borrowers. Exchange rate intervention affects dollar trade. We don't use dollars for trade. Reserve freezes hurt nations with dollar reserves in your custody. Our reserves are gold in our vaults. Sanctions damage economies dependent on your infrastructure. We built infrastructure that bypasses yours. Every tool assumes the target is inside your system. We're outside your system. The tools don't reach us. The weapons miss their target. The leverage doesn't apply. You're deploying weapons designed for the last war. The war where you controlled all the infrastructure. Where your currency was the only option. Where your banks were required for international transactions. Where your system was unavoidable. Those weapons worked in that war. They devastated nations that challenged you. They crushed economies that resisted. They forced compliance from governments that opposed you. But this is a different war. A war where alternatives exist. Where your infrastructure is optional. Where your currency is unnecessary. Where your system can be avoided. The weapons that worked in the last war don't work in this war. The tactics that succeeded before fail now. The strategy that dominated then loses now. You're using leverage you don't have. Leverage requires dependency. If I depend on you for something essential, you have leverage. If I need access to your system, you can threaten to deny access. If I require your currency, you can threaten to restrict it. If I rely on your infrastructure, you can threaten to block it. But leverage disappears when dependency ends. When I don't need access to your system, threatening to deny it is meaningless. When I don't require your currency, restricting it is irrelevant. When I don't rely on your infrastructure, blocking it is impotent. You're threatening to take away things we don't need. You're leveraging dependencies that don't exist. You're using power you no longer possess. You're threatening consequences we don't fear. Consequences are only threatening if they're worse than the alternative. You threaten economic isolation. But we're already choosing isolation from your system. You threaten to cut us off from dollar trade. But we're already conducting trade in AGS. You threaten to freeze reserves. But our reserves are already beyond your reach. You threaten sanctions. But we're already operating outside your infrastructure. Every consequence you threaten is something we're already accepting voluntarily. Every punishment you promise is a condition we're already choosing deliberately. The threats are empty because we're not afraid of the consequences. We've already decided those consequences are preferable to continued subordination. Because we've opted out. Because we've built alternatives. Because we've eliminated the dependencies your power relied on. Opting out is the ultimate response to coercive power. You can't force someone who refuses to participate. You can't control someone who exits your system. You can't leverage someone who eliminates dependencies. Opting out is the nuclear option of economic resistance. It's costly, it's difficult, it's risky, but it's effective. Completely effective, permanently effective. Because once you've opted out, once you've built alternatives, once you've eliminated dependencies, the coercive power becomes irrelevant. The threats become meaningless. The weapons become useless. We've built alternatives to every function your system performed. Alternative currency for trade, alternative reserves for liquidity, alternative infrastructure for transactions, alternative institutions for financing, alternative systems for everything. The alternatives aren't perfect. They're new. They're developing. They're being refined, but they work. They function. They serve our needs. And they improve every day. Every week makes them more efficient. Every month makes them more capable. Every year makes them more competitive. The alternatives we built are becoming superior to the system we left. We've eliminated the dependencies your power relied on. No dependency on dollar trade. No dependency on dollar reserves. No dependency on dollar debt. No dependency on dollar infrastructure. No dependency on dollar anything. The dependencies that gave you leverage over African economies for 70 years are gone, ended, eliminated. We identified every dependency. We understood how each one gave you power. We systematically eliminated each one. We replaced each dependency with independence. We substituted each vulnerability with strength. The dependencies are gone. Your power based on those dependencies is gone with them. You're fighting the last war with the last war's weapons, but this is a different war, and your weapons don't work in it. The last war was about controlling nations trapped in your system. This war is about preventing nations from leaving your system. The last war you won easily. This war you're losing badly. The last war your weapons were devastating. This war your weapons are impotent. The last war your strategy was effective. This war your strategy is failing. You're trying to win this war with the tools that won the last war, but the tools don't work. The weapons don't reach. The strategy doesn't succeed. You need new tools, new weapons, new strategy. But you don't have them. You haven't developed them. You're still fighting with obsolete weapons against an enemy that's evolved beyond your capability to hurt. This is a different war because we changed the battlefield. The last war was fought on your territory, in your system, using your currency, through your infrastructure. You controlled the battlefield. You set the rules. You determined the terms. You won because you controlled the terrain. This war is fought on different terrain, outside your system, using our currency, through our infrastructure. We control this battlefield. We set these rules. We determine these terms. Your weapons designed for your battlefield don't work on our battlefield. Your tactics developed for your system don't succeed in our system. Your strategy built on your control fails when we control the terrain. Your weapons don't work in this war because this war is about something different. The last war was about compliance within your system. This war is about exit from your system. The last war you could win by making compliance less painful than resistance. This war you can't win because we're not seeking better terms within your system. We're seeking exit from your system entirely. You can offer better terms, lower interest rates, fewer conditions, more flexibility. But better terms within a system of subordination are still subordination. We're not negotiating for better subordination. We're ending subordination. Your weapons don't work because they're designed to force compliance. We're not seeking compliance. We're seeking independence. I am Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. The dollar controlled Africa for 70 years. That control ended today. We launched the African gold standard, backed by our wealth, controlled by us. Operating outside your system. 70 years, 7 decades, a lifetime, multiple generations, long enough that dollar dominance seemed natural, seemed inevitable, seemed permanent. Long enough that alternatives seemed impossible, seemed impractical, seemed unrealistic. Long enough that dependency seemed unavoidable, seemed necessary, seemed beneficial. 70 years of dollar control over African economies, 70 years of being forced to use your currency, 70 years of subordination disguised as partnership, 70 years of extraction disguised as development. That control ended today, not gradually, not eventually, today, this moment, with the launch of AGS, with the establishment of the Gold Bank, with the creation of alternatives, with the elimination of dependencies, with the choice to opt out. 70 years of control ended in one day, the day we decided to be free. That control ended today because we ended it, not because you gave it up, not because you reformed your system, not because you treated us fairly. You would have continued controlling us forever if we let you. You would have maintained dollar dominance indefinitely if we accepted it. You would have extracted wealth eternally if we tolerated it, but we didn't let you. We didn't accept it. We didn't tolerate it. We ended it. Through our choice, through our action, through our determination, we ended 70 years of dollar control because we decided 70 years was enough. Because we concluded that continued subordination was unacceptable. Because we determined that independence was worth any cost. We launched the African gold standard, not as experiment, not as protest, not as gesture, as replacement, as alternative, as solution. We launched AGS as the currency that will replace dollars in African trade, as the reserve that will replace dollars in African central banks, as the unit that will replace dollars in African commerce. We launched it seriously, professionally, completely, with 47 tons of gold backing, with institutional infrastructure supporting, with political commitment sustaining, with technical capability operating. AGS is not aspirational, it's operational. Not theoretical, it's practical. Not planned, it's launched. The African gold standard is functioning right now, processing transactions, settling trades, holding reserves, financing development, doing everything dollars did, but doing it for us instead of for you. Backed by our wealth, not by promises, not by government guarantees, not by central bank commitments, by physical gold, tangible assets, real wealth. 47 tons of gold in vaults we control, gold we can see, gold we can touch, gold we can verify. The backing is not abstract, it's concrete, not hypothetical, it's actual. Not future, it's present. Every AGS in circulation is backed by 0.1 grams of gold. Every unit of currency is redeemable for physical gold. Every holder of AGS can convert to gold on demand. The backing is real. The wealth is ours. The value is maintained by physical assets that can't be printed or manipulated or inflated away. Controlled by us, not by the Federal Reserve, not by the IMF, not by Western institutions, by the African Gold Bank, by the member nations, by us. We control the monetary policy. We determine the issuance. We manage the reserves. We set the rules. We make the decisions. The control is complete. The sovereignty is total. The independence is absolute. Nobody else has veto power over our decisions. Nobody else can override our policies. Nobody else can impose their preferences on our system. The control is ours, exclusively, permanently, irreversibly. Operating outside your system, not integrated with SWIFT, not cleared through New York, not settled through Western banks, not dependent on your infrastructure, operating completely independently. Functioning entirely separately, working totally outside your reach. The Pan-African payment and settlement system processes transactions without touching your networks. The AGS clearing system settles trades without routing through your banks. The Gold Bank provides liquidity without accessing your facilities. We operate outside your system, by design, by choice, by determination. We built parallel infrastructure specifically to avoid your control. We created independent systems specifically to escape your reach. We established separate institutions specifically to operate beyond your power. The age of dollar dominance is ending. The era of African monetary sovereignty is beginning. And no amount of interest rate manipulation, currency intervention, or financial threats will stop what's coming. The age of dollar dominance is ending. Not might end, not could end, not will end, eventually, is ending. Present tense, happening now. The dominance that seemed permanent is proving temporary. The control that seemed unbreakable is breaking. The hegemony that seemed inevitable is ending. The signs are everywhere. The evidence is mounting. The trajectory is clear. Dollar's share of global reserves is declining. Dollar's role in international trade is shrinking. Dollar's use in commodity pricing is diminishing. Dollar's dominance is ending. Not because of American decline alone, because of global South rise, because of alternative emergence, because of our choice to opt out. The age is ending. The era is concluding. The period is finishing. The era of African monetary sovereignty is beginning. Not might begin, not could begin, not will begin someday. Is beginning, right now, this moment. The sovereignty that seemed impossible is proving achievable. The independence that seemed unrealistic is becoming real. The freedom that seemed unattainable is being attained. AGS is operational. The Gold Bank is functioning. The payment systems are processing. The alternatives are working. African monetary sovereignty is not aspiration, it's reality, not future, it's present. Not dream, it's fact. The era is beginning, the age is starting, the period is commencing. And no amount of interest rate manipulation, currency intervention, or financial threats will stop what's coming. We've heard the threats, we've seen the manipulation, we've felt the pressure, and we're continuing anyway, building anyway, advancing anyway. Your interest rate changes don't stop us. Your currency interventions don't slow us. Your financial threats don't deter us. Because we've eliminated the vulnerabilities those tools exploited. Because we've built systems those weapons can't reach. Because we've created alternatives those threats can't destroy. You can manipulate. You can intervene. You can threaten. But you can't stop what's coming. Can't prevent what's building. Can't reverse what's happening. The future is coming regardless of your opposition. The transformation is occurring despite your resistance. The change is happening whether you accept it or not. We are Burkina Faso, we are Mali, we are Niger, we are Zimbabwe, we are Eritrea, we are the African nations that said no to your currency monopoly. We are Burkina Faso, the nation that launched AGS, the country that proved alternatives are possible, the government that demonstrated opting out works. We are the first, the pioneers, the proof of concept. We are Burkina Faso, small nation, limited resources, facing enormous opposition, but succeeding anyway, proving anyway, demonstrating anyway. We are the nation that said no first, that built alternatives first, that achieved independence first. We are Burkina Faso. We are Mali, the nation that joined second, the country that validated the model, the government that proved this wasn't an isolated case. We are Mali, larger economy, more resources, facing similar opposition, but succeeding similarly, following the path Burkina Faso created, replicating the model, confirming the approach. We are the nation that proved one wasn't alone, that the model works elsewhere, that the demonstration effect is real. We are Mali. We are Niger, the nation rich in uranium, the country with resources the West needs, the government that chose sovereignty over exploitation. We are Niger, valuable resources, strategic location, facing intense pressure, but resisting anyway, joining the gold bank, adopting AGS, building independence. We are the nation that proved resource-rich countries can resist, that having what they want doesn't mean surrendering to their demands, that sovereignty matters more than their approval. We are Niger. We are Zimbabwe, the nation that survived decades of sanctions, the country that learned to function despite Western opposition, the government that already knew how to operate outside their system. We are Zimbabwe, long experience with isolation, deep understanding of resistance, proven capability for survival. We are the nation that brought experience to the gold bank, that contributed knowledge of how to function under pressure, that demonstrated that survival despite opposition is possible. We are Zimbabwe. We are Eritrea, the nation that never accepted subordination, the country that always insisted on independence, the government that refused to compromise sovereignty. We are Eritrea. Fierce independence, absolute determination, unwavering commitment. We are the nation that brought uncompromising dedication to the gold bank, that contributed absolute refusal to submit, that demonstrated that determination matters more than resources. We are Eritrea. We are the African nations that said no to your currency monopoly, not just these 5, but the 20 that will join by 2025, the 35 that will join by 2027, the 50 that will eventually participate. We are the African nations that refused to accept dollar dominance as permanent, that rejected currency monopoly as inevitable, that chose to build alternatives rather than accept subordination. We are the nations that said no, that built alternatives, that achieved independence. We are the African nations that ended your currency monopoly on our continent. We are awake, we are building, we are free. We are awake, not asleep anymore, not unconscious, not unaware. We see clearly now. We understand completely. We recognize fully. We see how your system works. We understand how your control operates. We recognize how your dominance functions. We see the debt traps. We understand the currency manipulation. We recognize the extraction mechanisms. We are awake to the reality of how your system subordinates us, how your currency controls us, how your dominance exploits us. We are awake, and once awakened, we cannot be put back to sleep. Once aware, we cannot be made unaware. Once we see the chains, we cannot unsee them. We are building, not just talking, not just planning, not just dreaming. Building, creating, constructing. We are building the gold bank. We are building AGS. We are building payment systems. We are building clearing infrastructure. We are building independence, not theoretically, practically, not eventually, now, not partially, completely. We are building the alternative to your system, the replacement for your currency, the infrastructure for our independence. We are building every day. Every week brings more progress. Every month brings more capability. Every year brings more independence. We are building. We are free, not perfectly free, not completely free, not absolutely free, but more free than we were, more free than we've been, more free than you want us to be. We are free from dollar dependence. We are free from currency manipulation. We are free from financial control. We are free to make our own decisions. We are free to set our own policies. We are free to determine our own future. The freedom is not complete, but it's real. The freedom is not absolute, but it's growing. The freedom is not perfect, but it's ours. We are free, and we're becoming more free every day. You came with dollars designed to control us. We came with gold designed to free us. You came with dollars, paper currency, fiat money, government promises. You came with currency you could print without limit, currency you could manipulate without restriction, currency you could weaponize without hesitation. You came with dollars designed to control, designed to extract, designed to subordinate. The dollars were never neutral, never just currency, never simply medium of exchange. The dollars were tools of control, instruments of dominance, weapons of hegemony. You came with dollars designed to control us, to force us to use your currency, to make us dependent on your system, to give you power over our economies. You came with dollars designed to control. We came with gold, physical metal, tangible asset, real wealth. We came with gold that can't be printed, gold that can't be manipulated, gold that can't be weaponized the same way. We came with gold designed to free, designed to protect, designed to liberate. The gold is not just backing, not just reserve, not just asset. The gold is declaration of independence, statement of sovereignty, assertion of freedom. We came with gold designed to free us, to back currency you can't control, to support system you can't manipulate, to establish independence you can't destroy. We came with gold designed to free, and gold always wins.